To Ukraine now, where there are growing concerns that the campaign against Russia is stalling along the front lines. With the supply of Western weapons held up by political disputes, Ukrainian soldiers are increasingly relying on their own creations to help defend against Russian forces. We'll have a special report on that in just a moment. But first, a look at why the high hopes for Ukraine's summer counteroffensive have been all but dashed.
Looking back, but also looking forward. In February, Ukraine's president marked a year since the start of Russia's invasion, remembering the fallen, rewarding those who made it, and raising hopes for the second year of the war.
We have survived. We have not been defeated, and we will do everything to win this year.
Zelensky promised to take the offensive in 2023. With his forces bolstered by deliveries of Western weapons and equipment, hopes were high for a decisive victory. In early June, after months of preparation, his troops launched their attack. They hit the Russians on 3 axes, 1 in the east, 2 in the south. The main objective was to cut the Russian army in 2 and sever its supply lines to Crimea. It was an ambitious plan. After months of intense and costly fighting, Ukraine succeeded in making some gains, but slowly and painfully. The battle for the southern village of Robotyne was symbolic of the difficulties. Ukrainian forces encountered well-prepared Russian defences, with dense minefields, mazes of trenches, barbed wire, and anti-tank ditches.
The battles are fierce, but we are moving forward, and that's the main thing. I thank you guys for every Ukrainian flag that is now returning to its rightful place.
By the time the Ukrainian flag was raised over Robotyne at the end of August, Ukraine's army had suffered heavy losses. Zelensky said Ukraine had waited too long for Western weapons. The delay gave Russia more time to prepare the battlefield. As his forces took stock, Zelensky headed to Washington to bolster support for the war effort. After the setbacks, Republicans are reluctant to release more funds for Ukraine.
Ukrainians haven't given up and won't give up. We know what to do, and you can count on Ukraine, and we hope just as much to be able to count on you.
But Ukraine and the United States are at odds over what to do next. Kyiv wants to go back on the offensive. The US wants it to pursue a more conservative strategy. Russia, meanwhile, has regrouped and reinforced its troops. This footage claims to show a Ukrainian unit on the defensive near the eastern city of Avdiivka. Ukraine's counteroffensive failed to deliver. Only a new strategy and renewed international support can break what has now become a stalemate.
For more, I want to bring in now Frank Ledwidge. He is a senior lecturer in military strategy at Portsmouth University. He's also a former British military intelligence officer. He joins us tonight from Oxford. Frank, it's good to have you with us again. If I go back to the early part of this year and think about the anticipation that was building in the spring that followed a stalled Russian offensive from the preceding winter, and you had Ukraine receiving heavy weapons and training from NATO members. And then at some point, we were talking about Ukraine's attacks stalling. Is there one event in your recollection that would explain how we've gone from anticipation to disappointment?
Well, good evening, Brent. It's nice to be with you. Look, your report there mentioned expectations, and expectations were high, certainly at that political level. But I was there just before the offensive started, and Ukrainian military officials at the highest levels were not so dreamy-eyed as perhaps some Western commentators. Mm-hmm. And they accepted the reality that this was an attritional war. Their expectations were that this would be the first of a series of blows in an attritional campaign. Now, the blame game since that, even those minimal objectives, which, by the way, specifically were to get to the town and stronghold of Tokmak, they fell short by about 20 kilometers. I thought they would get there. They didn't. Those expectations weren't met. And there has been, as I said, something of a blame game. the three-pronged assault that was mentioned there in your fine summary before is one element. The US recommended, I think probably rightly, one focused assault with perhaps some diversionary attacks. It's Western, and indeed any sensible military strategy will posit one main axis, and there was no one main axis. Also, Western commentators will talk about the delay, again mentioned in your report, that allowed the Russians to strengthen their forces. What the Ukrainians would say is, yes, we are waiting for those weapons. Westerners would say wrongly that Ukraine should be expected to conduct combined arms operations. They didn't have nearly enough time to change their military culture. Mm-hmm. So look, the blame game has now stopped, and we are where we are. The question you asked, as for a single event, no, I don't think so, because of course the overriding element of this is the enemy's got to vote, and Russian defences were simply too strong.
Frank, I want to ask you, I was in the U.S. recently, and I was struck by the reporting there about this war. And the message was that U.S. military officials have been pushing Ukraine to follow one certain strategy. Ukraine's military officials wanted to follow a different strategy, and that explains why we're at what has come to be an unfortunate place in this course of events. Can we explain it? Is it that easily explained that the Ukrainians have not done what the Americans would have liked them to do?
I think that's verging on the specious, with all due respect to those senior American advisors. The realities on the ground were that Ukraine has an army of 800,000 men and a few thousand female combatants. You cannot prepare an army that size to fight the kind of combined arms operations that NATO professional forces trained for decades in this would be expected to fight. Even if they had that time, they didn't have anything like the resources they required to do so. For example, the assumptions for such combined arms operations in the West, in NATO, would be and were in, for example, Iraq in 2003 or 1991, that we would have overwhelming air dominance. In other words, simple air dominance. There was no way the Ukrainians were going to get that, even in the area of drones. So those assumptions, I think, were misconceived from the start. Ukraine has its own military culture, which is derived from Soviet military culture, and that's the natural way of things in an army like that. You cannot shift that in 1.5 years of intense combat or the 7 years of desultory NATO training that went before. So no, I don't buy that at all. And I would stress the one point that if the United States and its senior commanders and political leaders were really determined to allow Ukraine not just to sustain itself, but to go forward and win, then they should release their own armories. They have thousands of military vehicles ready to go in the long term. And I've argued for a long time, along with many others, that of course, the release of those depends on a long-term strategy, which we have yet to see from the United States. Yeah, or NATO, for that matter.
Well, and I'm wondering what is this doing to the psyche of the soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers? They have been hearing now for more than a year from the West, particularly from the United States, that we are with you as long as it takes. And now President Zelensky was just in Washington trying to convince political leaders on Capitol Hill to, keep the aid and the weapons going at least into next year. I mean, that's a radically different position than what we've been hearing for most of this war. I mean, that's got to wear down the morale of the soldiers.
Yes, well, you hit the nail on the head there with that comment, as long as it takes. Those of us familiar, which is pretty much all of us, and many, many viewers, will remember that the it was never defined in previous Western campaigns and isn't defined now. Now, of course, we don't have that as the defining statement. What we have is not as long as it takes, but as long as we can, to quote President Biden the other day. And this goes back, I think, the key mistake, if there was one, and we'll come back to the soldiers on the front in a second, and it's a very simple one. We did not set a long-term strategy early enough, and I'm talking about 18 months ago. We must not forget that Ukraine will have to defend itself, not just next year, but for two years and 10 years ahead. And those preparations aren't being made either. Now, as for the soldiers at the front, I've spoken to 2 people at the front in the last 2 weeks and a few people in Kiev today. And the soldiers there, of course, morale is actually not as low as you would think. It's the kind of morale you would expect in an attritional battle. It's that these people are hard, they're determined, but they understand that difficulties lie ahead. They're still counterattacking and they're still holding. And now it's likely that they will continue to hold into the new year. But of course, the main constraint, as you said, is how long can that go on in the absence of the kind of vast assistance that they will need, not just next year, but into the future?
You know, Frank, you and I, we've talked numerous times since this war began, and correct me if I'm wrong, but tonight I can hear some serious frustration in your voice about, concerning the way this war is going right now. Let's look into 2024. What do you consider to be a realistic path that we're going to see the Ukrainian military being able to take?
Right. So at the tactical level, their objectives will clearly be to hold on to what they've got, and they're managing to do that now under very great pressure. The challenge will come, of course, look, who's got a crystal ball? But the likelihood is there'll be further Russian efforts after the Russian elections, I suspect, and a further Russian mobilization. Now, that will challenge Zelensky and his team to essentially to introduce conscription, because one of the main constraints in Ukrainian overall Ukrainian approach is manpower. The second, of course, is equipment. So with those constraints in mind, the expectation should be, look, we'll hold on to what we've got. But also there's another element here. And I think that another approach they will take and should take is to strengthen the connective tissues of their armed forces. The West now, even looking towards China, is looking at cross-domain integration. Now, the Ukrainians aren't going to get there yet, but if anyone's going to get there in Europe, it's them. And I think that, just to summarize General Zaluzhny's statement, I think from this week or last week, look, we're looking for something to break the impasse, to break the stalemate that he now says they're not in, but evidently are. And I think what that might be is this cross-domain integration and strengthening, for example, their electronic warfare capabilities, focusing on the terrible effects of drone warfare. And they're doing that right now. But look, all of this absolutely requires huge amounts of Western assistance. They will need to sustain this attritional war right into the future. And what we need now is a firm decadal strategy as to how Ukraine is going to go from what amounts to an ex-Soviet army with a mishmash of equipment, Soviet Western, into a NATO standard armed forces. We're seeing that start with the F-16s and the air defences, which are great signs, particularly air defences. But across the piece, not so much.
Frank, before we let you go, I just want to ask you, how important is U.S. congressional approval of more aid for Ukraine? How important is that to Ukraine's military being able to, survive all of 2024? Or, I mean, are we at a situation that is that dire?
Well, it's absolutely central, but it always has been. This shouldn't be a moment of panic any more than this time last year was, in that US assistance, and to a lesser extent European, although the cupboard's bare there, I think, in terms of equipment, and this is in terms of equipment we're talking about here, because the Ukrainians are going to get a fair amount of money from Europe, but they're not going to be able to spend it on anything. They need US material assistance, US assistance with leveraging ammunition from around the world. If they don't get that, they will be in trouble, and there may have to be serious consideration given to another approach than military defence. So it's absolutely central, but it always has been, Brent, since day one. The US set itself out in this war to be the arsenal of democracy, and right now it's not meeting that definition. And some would say, I would say certainly at least for the last year or so, it hasn't. It hasn't opened its arsenals. It shows no sign of doing so. And I'm speaking here of the thousands of tanks, armoured vehicles, and yes, jet aircraft, and and more importantly, the enablers that hold all that together. It shows no sign of releasing those anytime soon, and it needs to.
Military analyst Frank Ledwidge. As always, Frank, we appreciate your time and your honest and candid analysis. Very important right now, as it always is. Thank you.